Welcome back. We are beginning to cover variables and simple data types, and our book does a nice job of introducing us to strings and the basic number data types. But I wanted to go over a little bit more broadly some of the categories of simple data that we can process in Python. And I've put in our course notes on Canvas a link to a article on realpython.com. It's a great information site about the Python programming language and different things that you can do in Python. So if you click that link, it's going to take you to a page that summarizes the basic data types in Python. And you can see there are actually a fairly significant number of basic simple data that we can have, and I've just listed them on the page here. So they basically fall into six categories. First of all, we have the top three are all different types of numbers. So integers are the most basic number category, and these are numbers that do not have any decimal. So it's a whole number, no fractions whatsoever. So 5 is an integer, 17 is an integer, but 5.4 is not, or 5 and 3/4 is not. So whole numbers only, but they can be negative, they can be zero, they can be positive. The second category are floating point numbers. So these are numbers that do have a decimal place. So 5.2 would be a floating point number, 6.7, negative 45.8. Another thing worth noting here is that these numbers have a decimal, but you can have a zero after the decimal point. So 5.0 would be a floating point number, even though the number is actually equal to 5, which would be an integer in terms of how mathematically we would evaluate those two. So if it's got a decimal point, it's a floating point number. If it does not have a decimal point, it's an integer. Then there's a category of complex numbers. So if you have taken some advanced math courses, you probably are familiar with complex numbers. Complex numbers are numbers that include an imaginary component. So you may recall that the imaginary number is the square root of -1. And that's a number that is useful in a bunch of different kinds of calculations. And so Python has a way to deal with complex numbers. So those would be numbers that are floating point, but also include an imaginary component. Then moving on, strings are character data. So a string is a string of different letters and numbers and alphanumeric characters, Unicode characters. So for instance, going back to our program that we wrote last week, when we put hello world inside quotations, that was a string. So it's a string of characters. And of course, you could also have a string that is just one character long, such as the letter A or the letter Z, or even the number 1 in quotation marks would be a string. So there is some overlap between these categories, and we have methods to convert from one to another. We'll get into those a little bit later this week and next week. And then we have bytes and byte arrays. We aren't going to spend a lot of time on these in this class, but basically a byte lets you examine data as the computer sees it, so in binary code. So a byte is 8 bits, a combination of 8 zeros or ones, and we have a way to manipulate that directly. And then the final type is Boolean, and that is simply a true or false. So either an on or off, a yes or no, a 1 or a 0 in terms of a bit. So these are our simple data types. Let's go over to VS Code and start looking at how to do, in particular, we're going to start as the book does with strings. So I have VS Code up here. Hopefully you can get yours open and follow along, try some different things, and we are going to create a new Python file. let's go ahead and give it a name. Do save as variables. There we go. All right, so that now that is showing variables.py, and we can start typing our code. So we'll begin with just what we had last week. So you will remember last week we just did print hello world. Okay, so in Python, when we have a statement like this print is actually a function. We are calling some code somewhere else, and we're sending it a message. The message in this case is hello world. And hello world, when we have some text that is surrounded by quotation marks, that is a string. Um, and so let's try running this, run without debugging. This. Okay, so if we run it, run without debugging, it's the first time I have used VS Code to run code on this computer. That's why it popped up that thing asking which Python we wanted to use. But we see down at the bottom here the output, and it simply says hello world. All right, so we can change what is inside this. We can change this to my name instead of world, hello Todd. Let's give it some exclamation marks. And if we run, down here we see the output, hello Todd. Program has run successfully. All right, now let's say we want to use a variable instead of just putting the quotations here, but we want to assign this string to a variable. In Python, you simply have to come up with a variable name. Let's call this variable, let's say we'll call it message. And you say message equals, and then whatever you want the message to be. And at the end of the line, we just, in the quotation mark, if you have experience programming in other programming languages, there is no end of statement marker like a semicolon in Java. Simply the return message, return enter key, and the new line lets Python know that that is the end of that statement. And then we can use that variable in this print statement like this. So this is going to take hello Todd, this string, and it's going to put that data into the variable that we named message. And then we're using that variable here to print that message out. So when we run this, run without debugging, down here we see we end up getting exactly the same output because the message is exactly the same as what we had before. So now we could change this and say we want to say hello to somebody named Joe. And if we run it, we get hello Joe. Now, one of the things you may note is that VS Code is going to automatically, every time we make a change to a file, it's going to save the file for us automatically. So we don't need to worry about doing some kind of file save before we run our code. It's going to save it immediately whenever we make a change. Okay, so let's see. A few things about strings. First of all, I mentioned that a string can be just a single character long. So let's try that. Message is just H. If we run it, we get just the letter H printed out by itself and nothing else. For naming variables, the convention in Python is to have variable names entirely in lowercase and have different words separated with underscores. So if you wanted to title this variable greeting message, the way to do that in Python would be greeting underscore message. If some of you have programmed in other programming languages, this might be a little bit different than what you're used to. For instance, in Java, the normal would be to do greeting with a lowercase and then the second word, no space, but you would do message with a capital M. But that's not the standard in Python, and we'll talk a little bit later this week about what the standards are. But for now, just know that when you're creating a variable, if your variable wants to use two words in the name, you're going to separate the words with an underscore, and it's going to be in all lowercase. And then, of course, we need to then update our print message as well. So greeting message here, and now when we go to run this, it is going to work again. Now, what if we were to change the name of the variable here, but we forget to update it in the print statement? Let's see what happens when we do this. Now, the problem with this is that it's trying to use a variable named message, but we've never created a variable named message. That doesn't exist. And so Python is going to complain to us. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen here, what we see for the output, it first of all, it highlights where the error is. It says there's an error on line 3. So our code, VS Code, nicely numbers all of the code lines. So we know that the problem is on line 3. And then it does these little carrots pointing to message. That's where the problem is on that line. And then it says name error, name message is not defined. So that's actually a pretty helpful error. It tells us exactly what we did wrong. And we go back and look at that point in our code and we realize, oh yeah, I didn't actually use a variable named message. I used a variable named greeting message. All right, let's put this back to hello world and make sure that that works. Greeting message is equal to hello world. That's putting, again, the hello world string into the variable greeting message, and then we print it out. Now, one of the handy things in Python, and this is, as far as I know, unique to Python, other languages don't do this like this. I think maybe JavaScript does. But with Python, you can use either single quotes or double quotes around your string. So this is with single quote, hello world, and then an ending single quote is the same as if we use double quotes. Either one of those will work and will give us exactly the same result. All right, so let's try running this. Okay, so one of the reasons that that is handy is that we can now include whichever the one we don't use for our string, we could include that inside of our string. So let's say it's a new world. Yay. So there we've got our string encapsulated with the double quotation marks, but we use a single quote inside of it, and that's not going to give us any problems. It's a new world. Now we would have a problem though if we used single quotes for our string, because the first time it runs into the single quote, we're telling Python, all right, we're starting a new string, and then the apostrophe in it it's thinking we're ending the string there, that that's the end. And so now the string ends there, and all of this extra code after that shouldn't be there, and it's just confusing the compiler. So if you want to use a single quote, the easiest way is to just enclose your string in double quotes. And we can do the opposite of that. We can do a single quote for our string, and then we can do, so we can do, she said, hello world. So now we're using double quotes to write a message inside of our string that's encapsulated with single quotes. And if we run this down here, we get, she said, quote, hello world. There is a way to get around this if you want to use both. For instance, if we wanted to say, she said, quote, it's a girl, now we have a little bit of a problem because we're using inside of our string, we want to use both double quotation marks and single quotation marks. And obviously we've got to use one or the other to set the string aside. And so the way to get around this is that if you need to use the same um, type of quotation mark that you're using to mark out your string, then inside of the string you put a backspace in front of it. And that's going to tell it, this isn't the single quote that's going to end my string. Rather, I want you to include a single quote in my string. So let's try running this. All right, and down here we see the output. She said, it's a girl. It worked out exactly the way we wanted. So we can do this with double quotes as well. So let's go back to double quotes for our string. And she said, hello. Now here, because I want hello to be in quotations in the string, I put a backslash double quote both before hello and then another one after hello. So I'll put a space there just so that you can see how this works. Um, so the first quotation mark and the last quotation mark are going to be the beginning and end of the string, and then the two with backslashes are going to actually be part of the text that's in the string. And if we run this, she said hello. Okay, good deal. Hopefully that's clear. You can play with that a little bit and try it out and um, mess around with it. All right, what if we try to do, she said hello, and then tried to end our string with a backslash quotation mark? That's going to be a problem because it's going to interpret this as part of the string rather than the ending of the string. And if we try to run it like that, we get our error message down here at the bottom. Error is on line 1. Reading message equals, she said hello, and it says syntax error, unterminated string literal detected at line 1. So that means we've got a string literal that we started, she said hello, and we didn't terminate it. We didn't put the final quotation mark to end that string. And so that's what is missing. So again, Python is pretty good at giving you error messages that make sense and that help you actually figure out what the problem is. All right, we will pick back up here shortly with some more things that we can do with strings. Thank you.